The internal consequences of the re-election of Trump are only interesting to me insofar as they might lead to a descent of the US into an autocracy. Outside of that, my take on the matter is basically fuck around, find out. Okay? You get what you voted for, dumbass. To those of us outside the US, however, the external consequences are of paramount importance. It's not soon enough for all the plans set in motion to play out, or not, yet, but 6 months in, the best I can say is that the bag has been mixed very thoroughly. Trump's tariff obsession, which should have surprised absolutely no one, as he's been beating this drum for 40 years, is his Achilles heel. It creates frictions that sabotage grand strategy, by which I mean the grand chessboard, the state v. state competition for dominance, because he insists on playing hardball with countries he should be softballing because he treats trade and foreign policy like they're not intertwined. It may be that he thinks he has the leverage to do both. In some cases he may be right, but in others he may find countries looking elsewhere, such as the EU towards China. How interesting a mirror it would be for the EU to end up the mirror of India, being cordial with China while being hostile with Russia. This is the opposite of what needs to happen. While the new Axis may be an alliance of convenience, they all have a bone to pick with Western countries, and that's enough to keep them loosely tied for now. Any fight with one of them will turn into a proxy fight with the others, just ask Ukraine. While the China hawks, like current Defense Undersecretary Eldridge Colby, are right that China is the primary threat, overwhelmingly so, the fact is that the Axis cannot be fought in isolation because they all have an interest in each other being victorious. A similarly united front is thus needed on the opposite side of the ledger with a coordinated defense strategy. Pushing members of that prospective coalition, such as the EU and India, toward making deals with the enemy powers out of economic interest will sabotage any such effort. Europe only just, and even then not entirely, extricated itself from being economically tied to Russia and thus being reluctant to back Ukraine. Now the Americans are making the same mistake because Trump wants to try to extract better trade terms from anyone and everyone, no matter who it pisses off. Especially when you are simultaneously trying to pressure Europe into massive military investment so they can handle the Russians themselves, which, to be clear, no matter how offensive or crude the methodology Trump employs, is absolutely the correct decision. Adding self-serving trade pressure on top of that comes off as extortionate, not cooperative. This is arguably even more true of India, as it is the only country with the sheer population to be able to confront the Chinese 1v1. The United States 100% should try to get India on side, as it would greatly ease the Americans' own need to commit all their resources to a fight with China, allowing them to be the backseat chess master, moving their pieces around where they're most needed. With Europe handling Russia, Israel handling Iran, India handling China, and South Korea handling North Korea, the US would find itself with much more freedom of action in terms of resource allocation. But this strikes me as too globalist for Trump to ever endorse. As he says, it's America first. The whole mood of his foreign policy is one of getting something out of others for America's benefit, but in a very direct transactional sense. Obviously, other countries being militarily tied to the US is to American benefit, but the effect is too ephemeral for someone like Trump to appreciate. I truly don't think he's the right person to try and put this grand plan into action. I hope I'm wrong, but it seems to me that in his hubris, he is going to leave the US with more burden for the fights it picks, and thus make it less likely for them to actually succeed. When you signal to the Europeans you don't care about the Russian threat and are focusing entirely on China, and, well, Iran, because he just loves Netanyahu so much, do you really expect them to help you on that front, or will they return the favor and only care about Russia, not China? If the only things you try to get out of dealing with India are better trade terms for yourself, would you ever expect them to help you out against the Chinese? This approach is just too short-sighted and transactional. It's a recipe for the US to find itself defending Taiwan and having no one except maybe Japan and the Philippines show up to help. Not exactly ideal. This sort of disjointed, selfish strategy was actually the doom of the original Axis powers. Had they coordinated with each other, they would have been far, far more dangerous than they ended up being. A world where they attacked the Western Allies simultaneously in 1940 and then the Soviet Union in 1941 is a scary one. Instead, they fought disjointed, vaguely linked wars that served their short-term interests but would have been better served in the long run had they acted in concert. It was also the reason the war went so disastrously for the Allies initially, ironically. Anglo-French refusal to ally with the Soviets led to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact being signed, meaning the Germans did not initially have to fight a two-front war. They were even less prepared to fight than in 1914, and could instead deal first with France and then the Soviets. The latter, of course, went wrong due to lack of coordination with the Japanese and delusions of invincibility. There would have been no grand blitz in the West had most of the Wehrmacht been caught up fighting with the Soviets in Poland from the start. Even with both the French and the Soviets being initially incompetent, which they were, this would have set the Nazis on the back foot from the beginning. Instead, they were dealt with in detail. The combination of Trump alienating potential allies through trade extortion and the simplistic, self-absorbed strategy of some China hawks who tend to think of a potential war in terms of a 1v1, probably because of their inflated perception of American capabilities, can easily lead to a similar defeat in detail. A fragmented, China-aligned Europe without U.S. support could end up being dismantled by an expansionist Russia, and a USA that goes it alone against China to save Taiwan could find itself outnumbered and outgunned extremely easily. Cooperation across Eurasia is necessary to combat the Axis, but Donald Trump is not the sort of person to wrangle such an alliance together because he's too selfish and too obsessed with twisting everything to maximize immediate, headline-grabbing benefit, regardless of longer-term consequences. Even his recent strike on Iran was only unintentionally filling the kind of role I feel the U.S. should be filling, a backstop to its frontline allies that allocates its own resources to support allies in critical places at critical times for maximum effect on the enemy. The only action the U.S. directly took in this air war in Iran was a single strike, firing bunker busters out of B-2s at underground nuclear complexes, a capability Israel lacked. That's an appropriate application of American force in a vacuum. Yet Trump did so seemingly recklessly, either betting that Iranian retaliation would be limited, as it was after he killed Soleimani, or not caring what retaliation resulted. The problem being, of course, that had Iran decided to retaliate by, say, overrunning U.S. bases in Iraq, or firing at American ships in the Gulf, ego would demand he double down rather than back off, thus potentially getting the U.S. bogged down in another protracted war in the Middle East, this time with Iran, and unable to counter the Chinese or anyone else due to the resource allocation necessary for such a war. Had Trump pulled American forces out of Iraq and the Gulf before launching his strike, thus preventing Iran from even having the option of dragging the U.S. into another quagmire, I might not have fretted so much about the news that he'd done it. Trump himself would probably argue it was a bet he won, given how pathetic the Iranian counterattack was, but the fact he didn't really hedge against that bet makes me uneasy with his judgment. Becoming entangled in another Middle East quagmire is exactly not what the U.S. needs, even if it is still an important theater against the Axis. Any American move to assist an ally in the region must be done carefully so as to avoid such an outcome. Both Trump's assassination of Soleimani and bombing of Iranian nuclear sites were justifiable on their own, but were done with the risk that Iranian retaliation could cause an all-out war. Granted, this is only the case due to residual U.S. military presence in the Middle East due to prior ill-conceived adventures there, but Trump has no excuse for leaving those forces in place, given he is commander-in-chief and has every authority to withdraw them. He is lucky Iran is an independent actor. Were the alliance between them and the Chinese tighter, they could very well intentionally goad the U.S. into a war to give China an opening to take Taiwan and end American hegemony. Even the recent kerfuffle over Ukraine aid, where Hegseth halted arms transfers to Ukraine over concerns that U.S. stockpiles were being depleted, demonstrates a lack of conscientiousness about the situation the U.S. finds itself in. They will not, and cannot, 1v1 the Chinese. The others literally won't let them. Even if the Americans themselves have no friends to help them, their enemies will help each other. The idea the Chinese will fight a war with the U.S. absent any support from their buddies in Moscow and Pyongyang is farcical. The only reason the Ukrainians burn through air-to-air missiles at such a high rate is because the Iranians get drones from Iran and missile components from China. And the reason Ukrainians as much artillery shells as they can grab is because the North Koreans stepped up to supply Russia with artillery after it burned through all its own stockpiles. Any American war with China would suffer the same fate. North Korea, Russia, and Iran would pitch in to help the Chinese put as much hurt on the Americans as possible. They all have it out for the Americans. It makes no sense whatsoever to try to compartmentalize the U.S. into a purely anti-China force. As such, being obsessed with U.S. stockpiles and ability to fight the Chinese directly while their enemies pool their resources to try to pick off a U.S. ally is fantastically short-sighted and self-absorbed. The obvious answer is to focus on ramping up production, not hoarding ammo. The enemy has no problem blowing ammo to hand the U.S. an L in Ukraine, so the U.S. should likewise have no problem blowing ammo to hand the Axis an L either. Europe has already made this calculation. Despite insufficient production to equip their own forces, they have sent huge amounts of equipment to Ukraine because this is a prime opportunity, better than most of them could ever have since they are smaller and even less capable of defeating Russia than Ukraine, to stop Putin in his tracks. That they still can't equip their own forces is a problem, but the solution is not to cede the battlefield to the enemy. The solution is to actually get serious about ramping up military production, and the Americans would do well to do the same. Granted, yes, in an ideal world, the US wouldn't need to provide much to Ukraine, or Europe for that matter, because the EU would be a military power in its own right, more than capable of fighting a proxy war with the Russians. One thinks of Tusk's quote about the absurdity of 500 million Europeans asking 300 million Americans to defend them from 140 million Russians, but we don't live in that world. Pressure to force Europe to militarize itself? Very welcome, but not to the point it means taking the L in Ukraine. At the very least, the US needs to keep providing Patriot missiles, since the Europeans currently have no equivalent to the Patriot to provide. Anything else Ukraine needs could be provided by Europe alone if the effort is put in. Indeed, given I would like the US to act as the backseater anyway, that would be ideal. But cutting Ukraine off entirely, or preventing them from buying US weapons rather than relying on donations, would needlessly hand the enemy a victory to little actual benefit to the US or the West in general beyond higher numbers in inventory counts. Ironically, it would in fact be putting America first in a grand strategy sense to assemble a new global alliance against this new Axis, since that gives the US its best shot at not losing its throne to China. But I genuinely fear that such a concept may be beyond the mentality of the man we need to steer the ship, i.e. Trump. Whether this ends up being a catastrophic problem depends entirely on how stubborn Trump's remain on his tariff crusade, although given he's been yapping about it for half a century at this point, I doubt he's ever changing his mind on that, and to what extent the enemy exploits the situation before Trump's term is up. We have to hope the Chinese don't intend to actually use those fancy new landing barges anytime soon, or we may be in quite a pickle.